7:14 in the morning. You're standing in a kitchen you haven't fully unpacked yet, holding a phone that just buzzed once. One notification. 10 digits attached to your name. You have rehearsed this exact moment since you were 19 years old. The moment you'd finally feel like you made it. And it's happening right now. Except the feeling you rehearsed never shows up. What shows up instead is something closer to dread. And nobody ever warned you that dread would come first. This is what actually happens in the hours, months, and years after you cross into 10-figure wealth, built from decades of research on sudden wealth psychology, and the rare handful of billionaires who've ever spoken honestly about what it actually felt like. Because the story you've been sold, the yacht, the relief, the finally arrived feeling, isn't the real one. There's a second story underneath it, a quieter one. And by the end of this, you'll understand why some of the richest people on earth describe the day they hit that number as one of the strangest days of their life. Not the best, not the worst, just strange. Let's start with the first hour, because that's where the surprises begin. You do what anyone would do. You try to call someone. Your first instinct is your spouse, or your mother, or the one friend who's been there since before any of this started. But halfway through dialing, you stop. Because you realize you don't actually know how to say it out loud without it sounding insane. So you call anyway. And the reaction on the other end isn't the reaction you expected either. It's careful. A little too careful. Like they're waiting to find out how they're supposed to feel about it before they let themselves feel anything. That's the first crack in the fantasy. You pictured this moment surrounded by people celebrating with you. Instead, you're standing in a half-unpacked kitchen, and the only person who fully understands what just happened is you. Psychologists have a name for what you're experiencing, and it isn't unique to billionaires. Harvard lecturer Tal Ben-Shahar coined it years ago. The arrival fallacy, the deeply human belief that reaching a huge goal will produce a huge, lasting emotional payoff. In reality, the payoff is a spike, not a plateau. It rises fast, and it fades fast, usually within days. Here's the part that stings the most. The people who loved you before the number now have to work harder to prove they still mean it. And the ones who only show up after the number never have to prove anything at all. They just show up, smiling, asking nothing of you at first. Which makes them, ironically, the hardest ones to spot. Every decision now carries more weight because every decision now has more zeros attached to it. Which advisor do you trust with the estate? Which family member gets a loan, and which one gets a conversation instead? Which stranger's pitch deck is genuine, and which one is designed specifically to find someone exactly like you? None of these decisions existed at this scale a year ago. Now there are dozens of them, every single week, and each one requires the same kind of focused judgment that used to be reserved for the biggest decisions of your life. Psychologists call the underlying mechanism decision fatigue, the idea that your capacity for careful judgment is a limited resource that drains throughout the day, the same way physical energy does. Most people spend that resource on what to eat and what to wear. You're now spending it on people who are actively optimized to get past your defenses. Add to that something researchers on sudden wealth flag constantly, a loss of ordinary privacy. Small errands stop being small. A stranger recognizing your name changes the tone of a simple transaction. Even something as mundane as walking into a bank can turn into a moment where you're reminded, again, that you're not moving through the world the way you used to. None of this shows up in the number in your account. It's invisible, but it's real, and it accumulates. Researchers Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton found back in 2010 that day-to-day emotional well-being in the U.S. rises with income only up to a fairly modest level. After that point, more income keeps improving how people evaluate their life overall, but it stops meaningfully improving how their actual days feel moment to moment. At $1 billion, you are so far past that point that almost the entire number is, emotionally, invisible to you. You didn't buy a life. You bought a magnifying glass pointed at every decision you make. There's a classic study from 1978. Researchers Philip Brickman, Dan Coates, and Ronnie Janoff-Bullman studied lottery winners and found something that still holds up decades later. After the initial spike faded, most winners settled back to roughly the same baseline happiness they had before the win. Not because the money vanished, because their minds adapted to the new normal almost as fast as their bank balance changed. This is hedonic adaptation, the same mental mechanism that makes a new car feel ordinary within a few months. It doesn't stop working just because the number gets bigger. If anything, the bigger the jump, the faster and more disorienting the adaptation feels, because the gap between what you expected to feel and what you actually feel is wider. So, if the money itself doesn't reliably buy lasting happiness, what does? In 2017, a Harvard Business School researcher named Ashley Willens, along with colleagues, published a study looking at exactly this question across income levels, including some very high earners. The finding was consistent. People who spent money to buy back their time, outsourcing chores, hiring help, reclaiming hours, reported meaningfully higher happiness than people who spent the same money on possessions. Time, not stuff, moved the needle. This lines up with something researchers Thomas Stanley and William Danko documented in The Millionaire Next Door. The wealthiest people who report genuine contentment usually aren't the ones performing wealth outwardly. They're the ones who quietly convert money into autonomy, control over their schedule, their relationships, and who gets access to their attention. That's the hidden truth. $1 billion doesn't buy you a better life automatically. It buys you the raw material for one. Enormous freedom over your time and your decisions, but only if you deliberately build the life around that freedom instead of around the number itself. Most people who reach this level don't do that on purpose. They do it by accident years later, usually after learning the hard way that the number alone was never going to do it for them. The people who navigate this, well, tend to do a few things differently, and none of them require $1 billion to start practicing. First, they protect a small circle deliberately instead of letting it form by accident. That means being upfront with old friends and family early, not after the trust inversion has already done its damage, about wanting the relationship to stay exactly the way it was. Second, they build structure around decision fatigue instead of absorbing it personally. That's part of why family offices and financial advisors exist at all, not as a luxury, but as a way of protecting the one resource that never scales alongside the money, your own attention. Third, and this is the one regular people can use immediately, long before any of them are close to $1 billion, they treat time, not possessions, as the asset worth spending on. Outsourcing the tasks that drain you, protecting hours for the relationships and work that actually matter. That's the exact behavior Willens' research found moved happiness the most, at every income level tested, not just the top of it. And fourth, they stop treating the number as the finish line. The arrival fallacy only wins if you keep expecting the next number to finally deliver the feeling this one didn't. The people who escape that trap redefine what they're actually chasing, usually toward purpose, autonomy, or relationships, long before they run out of numbers to chase. None of this makes the money meaningless. It just means the number was never the point. It was always going to be the tool. The question was always what you built with it. You're still standing in that half-unpacked kitchen. The phone is still in your hand. The number hasn't changed, but something else has. You came into this morning believing that number was the answer to a question you'd been asking your whole life. Will I finally be enough? Will I finally have made it? And what you're slowly realizing is that the number was never an answer at all. It was a much harder question, wearing an answer's clothes. Because now every choice that used to be made for you, by circumstance, by necessity, by simply not having the option, is a choice you have to make on purpose. What you build, who stays close, what you actually want your days to feel like, now that almost nothing is standing in the way. The people who handle this well figured that part out early. The ones who don't spend